The day we laid Rosalie to rest, my mother-in-law, the skies over Madrid seemed to weep with us. Dark, heavy clouds hung over the Almudena cemetery, as if determined to join in our collective mourning. I, Carmen, stood beside my husband, Alex, struggling to maintain my composure as I watched the mahogany coffin slowly lower into its final resting place. A biting November wind slipped between the cypress trees lining the cemetery, carrying the scent of damp earth and wilted flowers. The faces of those gathered showed a mix of sorrow and resignation. Some wept silently, while others murmured prayers. Yet, I felt strangely detached from it all. I stole a glance at Alex, his profile set, and his eyes lost somewhere on the horizon. For months we had been living in an emotional limbo, our marriage hanging by a thread so delicate that the slightest sigh threatened to snap it. Instead of uniting us in shared grief, Rosalie's death had only deepened the chasm between us. I recalled the first time I met Rosalie, back in that apartment in the Chimberry neighborhood. From the very start, her eyes had scrutinized me with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "So you're Alex's fiancé," she had said, her tone making it abundantly clear that I was hardly good enough for her son. Over the years, that first impression never changed. Every family dinner, every celebration, turned into a silent battleground on which I fought for her approval. The priest began reciting the final prayers, his deep voice resonating through the cemetery silence. A chill ran down my spine, not just from the cold. There was something in the atmosphere, a tangible tension that went beyond mere sorrow over a loss. Alex, standing next to me, remained as immobile as a statue, his knuckles white from gripping the stem of the rose he held. As the coffin touched the ground, memories of the past few months flooded my mind. The increasingly frequent arguments, the uncomfortable silences at dinner, the nights when Alex wouldn't even come home. Our relationship had deteriorated so much that, in my darkest moments, I even thought Rosalie's death might mark a new beginning for us. How wrong I was. The service drew to a close, and the mourners began approaching to offer their condolences. Aunt Lola, reeking perpetually of mothballs, hugged me tightly while whispering, "I'm so sorry, dear," that sounded more obligatory than sincere. Cousin Paul, ever eager to flaunt his business success, approached Alex with a firm handshake and backslaps that seemed more suited to sealing a deal than offering sympathy at a funeral. I watched as people drifted by, some familiar, others not so much, all bearing the same forced expressions. I wondered how many of them had truly loved Rosalie, and how many were there merely out of social obligation. Madrid might be a sprawling, cosmopolitan city, but in circles like ours, everyone knew each other, and appearances were everything. When the crowd finally began to disperse, Alex moved. With slow, mechanical steps, he approached the edge of the grave. I saw him hesitate for a moment, the rose trembling slightly in his hand. Then, with an almost imperceptible gesture, he dropped the flower onto the coffin. The dull thud of its landing seemed to snap him out of his reverie. For the first time all day, he turned his head toward me. The look in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. His normally warm, honey-colored eyes now appeared as dark, bottomless pits. There was something there I couldn't decipher, a blend of anger, pain, and something else, something that made me instinctively take a step back. "Let's go," he said in a voice that didn't sound like his own. Without waiting for a reply, he began walking toward the cemetery exit. I stood frozen for a moment, watching his back recede among the tombstones. Then, as if propelled by an unseen force, I followed him. The drive back home was a silent nightmare. Madrid streets blurred past the car window, the gray sky reflected in the puddles splashing along the sidewalk. Alex drove with his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly I feared they might snap it in two. I tried breaking the silence several times, but the words died in my throat before I could speak them. What could I say? That I was sorry? That everything would be okay? Lies, nothing would be okay. I knew that deep down. When we finally reached our apartment in Malesana, Alex got out of the car without a word and bounded up the stairs. I trailed behind him, my feet dragging as I felt the weight of the world upon my shoulders. Inside, I found him standing in the living room, staring intently at a photograph of his mother hanging on the wall. "Alex," I began, but he cut me off with a brusque gesture. "Don't say anything," he growled. "I don't want to hear your fake condolences or empty words of comfort. You never really cared for her, did you? You're probably relieved she's gone." His words struck me like a punch to the gut. How could he think that? Yes, my relationship with Rosalie had never been easy, but I would never have wished her death. "That isn't fair," I replied, anger beginning to boil inside me. "You know, I always tried to get along with her, but she was my mother." Alex roared, turning toward me with clenched fists. "And you were never good enough for her. For any of us." The silence that followed his outburst was deafening. We stared at each other, two strangers in what had once been our home. In that moment, I knew something had irreparably broken between us. The fragile thread holding our marriage together had finally snapped. Without another word, I turned and left the apartment. The tears I had held back all day finally spilled over as I rushed down the stairs. I stepped out into the street, letting my feet carry me away from Alex, away from it all. I wandered for hours through Madrid streets, blending into the crowd as I felt the city pulse around me, indifferent to my pain. I passed by San Miguel Market, where Alex and I used to spend lazy Sunday afternoons sampling tapas and laughing without a care. I crossed Main Square, once the stage for endless promises of eternal love that now felt hollow and meaningless. Eventually, I found myself in front of the Dibad Temple. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of red and gold. I sat on a bench, watching the pond's water reflect the last rays of the day. It was there, in that oasis of calm amid the city's clamor, that I finally allowed myself to cry, really cry. I wept for Rosalie, for the relationship we never had. I wept for Alex, for the man I once loved who now seemed a complete stranger. But above all, I wept for myself, for the woman I had been, and for the one I would have to become. As the first stars began to twinkle over Madrid, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to that apartment. I couldn't face Alex, not tonight. I pulled out my phone and dialed my friend Sophie's number. Her concerned voice on the other end of the line was like a balm for my wounded soul. "Carmen, are you all right? What happened?" "Sophie," my voice broke. "Can I stay at your place tonight?" "Of course, sweetheart. Come over right away." As I walked toward the metro, it felt as though I were closing a chapter of my life. Saying goodbye to Rosalie hadn't just marked the end of her existence, it was also the beginning of the end for my marriage to Alex. What I didn't know then was that that day, this terrible day, was only the start of a series of events that would change my life forever. That night, as darkness fell over Madrid, I was certain nothing would ever be the same again. The cold November wind accompanied me on my way to Sophie's, carrying away the last remnants of the life I'd known until now. In the days following Rosalie's funeral, time passed in a haze. I, Carmen, stayed at Sophie's, unable to face the apartment I once shared with Alex. Missed calls and texts piled up on my phone, but I lacked the strength to confront him. Blessed Sophie welcomed me without question, respecting my silence and my grief. One morning, while we were having breakfast in the small kitchen of her apartment in Lavapiés, Sophie finally broke the silence. "Carmen, dear, don't you think you should talk to Alex?" It's been nearly 2 weeks. I looked up from my cup of coffee, feeling the lump in my throat tighten. "I know, Sophie. It's just... I don't know what to say. I'm not even sure there's anything left to say." Sophie gazed at me with those big, understanding eyes that had always been my refuge since our university days. "I get it, but you can't hide forever. Sooner or later, you'll have to face this." She was right. I couldn't keep running, no matter how terrified I was of what I might find upon my return. So that very afternoon, I summoned enough courage to go back home. The metro ride from Lavapiés to Malesana felt endless. Every station made my heart beat faster. Standing before the door of our apartment, I hesitated. Should I ring the bell? Use my keys? Finally, I chose the latter. After all, it was still my home. The sound of the lock clicking open seemed deafening in the corridor silence. "Alex?" I called softly as I stepped inside. There was no answer. The apartment was shrouded in an eerie twilight. The curtains were drawn, and a musty, closed-in smell mingled with something else I couldn't quite place. I proceeded cautiously down the hall, sensing that something was terribly amiss. Clothes lay scattered on the floor, papers strewn about, as if a tornado had passed through. "Alex?" I called again, this time more forcefully. The ensuing silence sent chills down my spine. Entering the living room, I froze. The photograph of Rosalie that once adorned the wall now lay on the floor, its glass frame shattered. The walls bore marks as if someone had been battering them. And there, amidst all that chaos, was Alex. He was seated on the floor, surrounded by empty bottles, his gaze fixed on some spot on the wall. When he saw me, his eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment I caught a glimpse of something: relief? Anger? I couldn't tell, not before his face twisted into a grimace of agony. "You're back," he rasped in a voice I barely recognized. I took a step toward him, but something held me back. There was an unsettling rigidity in his posture, a tension in his shoulders that set off alarm bells. "Alex, what happened here?" He let out a bitter laugh, a laugh devoid of humor that sent shivers down my spine. "What happened?" "You left, Carmen. You abandoned me. Left me alone with all of this." I needed time, I tried to explain, but he interrupted with a brusque wave of his hand. "Time," he spat the word as if it were venom. "Time is the one thing we no longer have." He rose unsteadily, and instinctively I backed away. I'd never been afraid of Alex before, but at that moment, with his bloodshot eyes and disheveled face, I hardly recognized him. "Alex, you're drunk. We should talk when you're sober," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tremor coursing through me. "Sober?" he roared, advancing toward me. "How can I be sober? My mother is dead, Carmen. Dead. And you weren't even here." I slammed into the wall, panic beginning to grip me. "I'm sorry, really." But I was hurt, confused. "After the funeral, the things you said, the things I said." His face loomed inches from mine now, the smell of alcohol heavy on his breath. "You have no idea, Carmen. You know nothing." That's when I saw it. In his right hand, half hidden by the sleeve of his rumpled shirt, something metallic gleamed. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it was a kitchen knife. "Alex," I whispered, unable to tear my eyes away from the blade. "What are you doing?" For a moment, he appeared confused. He stared at the knife as if unsure how it had come to be there. Then his face hardened. "Something I should have done a long time ago. Everything happened in a matter of seconds." Alex raised his arm, and acting purely on instinct, I lunged to the side. The knife plunged into the wall where my head had been mere moments before. Seizing the opportunity of his surprise, I shoved him with all my might and bolted for the door. "Carmen!" His roar of fury chased me as I dashed out of the apartment. I hurried down the stairs 2 at a time, my heart pounding so fiercely I thought it might burst from my chest. I could hear Alex's footsteps behind me, growing ever closer. I stumbled onto the street, breathless, frantically scanning for help. Few in Carroll Street, usually bustling, seemed deserted at that moment. I spotted a group of tourists near the entrance of the Tribunal metro station, but they were too far away. I knew I wouldn't make it before Alex caught up with me. I turned the corner onto Velarde Street, desperate to find someone, anyone. That's when I saw it, the bar The Milky Way, one of our favorites during our early years together. Its lights were on, and I could see movement inside. Without a second thought, I dashed toward the door. I burst in like a gust of wind, startling the few patrons present at that early hour. The bartender, a kindly older man with a salt and pepper mustache who knew us from our many visits, looked at me with concern. "Carmen? What's wrong, dear?" I had no time to answer. The door swung open abruptly, and there stood Alex, panting, knife still clutched in his hand, his eyes wild with madness. Time seemed to freeze. The bar's customers stood rooted to the spot, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. The bartender, Manny, was the first to react. "Alex, son, what are you doing?" "Put that knife down," he said in a calm voice, though I could see fear in his eyes. Alex appeared not to hear him. His eyes remained fixed on me, as if the rest of the world had vanished. He took a step forward, and I backed into the counter. "The game's over, Carmen," he growled. "There's no escape now." At that moment, something inside me broke. All the fear, confusion, and pain of the past few weeks transformed into a burning anger that I never knew I possessed. "Enough, Alex," I shouted, surprised by the strength in my voice. "What do you think you're doing? Do you really believe this is what your mother would have wanted?" My words hit him like a physical blow. He staggered, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a glimpse of the man I had once loved, the man I had lost and now feared. I didn't," he stammered, staring at the knife in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. Then the bar door swung open again and 2 police officers entered, apparently alerted by a customer who had managed to call without us noticing. "Police. Everyone, stay still." What followed was chaos, movement, and shouting. Alex dropped the knife, its metallic clatter echoing on the tiled floor. The officers quickly subdued him, handcuffing him as he allowed them to take him down, as if all resistance had abandoned his body. I stood there, leaning against the counter, trembling uncontrollably as the adrenaline drained from me. Manny came over, draping a blanket over my shoulders and gently guiding me to a chair. "It's over now, dear." "It's all over," he murmured, his voice a steady anchor amid the storm raging within me. As the officers led Alex away, our eyes met one last time. In his gaze, I saw a mixture of regret, confusion, and something else, something I couldn't quite decipher at the time, but that would haunt me in the days and weeks to come. When the door closed behind them, I collapsed. The tears I'd held back finally flowed freely as sobs racked my body. Manny embraced me, his murmurs of comfort barely registering. In that moment, surrounded by the familiar sense of beer and aged wood in a bar filled with so many happy memories, I realized that my life had changed irrevocably. The man I had shared years of my life with, the man I thought I knew better than anyone, had become a dangerous stranger. As murmurs spread among the bar's patrons and I listened to the sirens of more police cars approaching, one question formed in my mind, one that would not let me rest in the days to come. What really happened to Rosalie? What dark secret was eating Alex from the inside? That afternoon, as Madrid's light faded, it became clear that this unexpected attack was just the beginning of something far bigger and more terrifying, something that, without our knowing, would force me to confront my deepest fears and uncover truths I'd rather have never known. In the days following Rosalie's funeral, time blurred by. I, Carmen, remained at Sophie's, unable to return to the apartment I once shared with Alex. Missed calls and messages piled up on my phone, but I lacked the strength to face him. Sweet Sophie took me in without question, honoring my silence and my sorrow. One morning, while we were having breakfast in the modest kitchen of her apartment in Lavapiés, Sophie finally broke the silence. "Carmen, honey, don't you think you should speak with Alex?" It's been almost 2 weeks. I lifted my eyes from my cup of coffee, feeling the knot in my throat tighten. "I know, Sophie. It's just... I don't know what to say. I'm not even sure there's anything left to say." Sophie looked at me with those big, understanding eyes that had always been my sanctuary since our college days. "I understand, but you can't hide forever. Sooner or later, you'll have to confront this." I knew she was right. I couldn't keep running, no matter how scared I was of what I might find. That very afternoon, I gathered the courage to return home. The metro ride from Lavapiés to Malesana felt interminable, each station making my heart beat faster. Standing before our apartment door, I hesitated. Should I ring the bell? Use my keys? Eventually, I chose the latter. After all, it was still my home. The sound of the lock clicking open seemed deafening in the silent hallway. "Alex?" I called softly as I stepped inside. There was no response. The apartment was cloaked in an eerie gloom. The curtains were drawn, and a stale, closed-in odor mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. I crept cautiously down the hallway, aware that something was terribly wrong. Clothes were scattered on the floor, papers strewn about, as if a storm had swept through. "Alex?" I repeated, this time with more urgency. The ensuing silence made my skin crawl. I entered the living room and froze. The picture of Rosalie that once hung on the wall now lay shattered on the floor. The walls were marred with scratches, as if someone had been frantically striking them. And there, in the midst of the chaos, sat Alex. He was on the floor, surrounded by empty bottles, his eyes fixed on some distant spot on the wall. When he saw me, his gaze snapped to mine, and for a moment I caught a flicker of something. Was it relief? Or anger? I couldn't tell before his face twisted in a grimace of pain. "You're back," he said in a hoarse voice that I barely recognized. I took a step toward him, but something stopped me. There was an ominous tension in his stance, in the tightness of his shoulders, that set off alarm bells. "Alex, what happened here?" He laughed bitterly, a laugh devoid of humor that chilled me. "What happened? You left, Carmen. You abandoned me. Left me alone with all this." I needed time, I tried to explain, but he cut me off with a curt gesture. "Time," he spat the word as though it were poison. "Time is the only thing we no longer have." He staggered to his feet, and instinctively I backed away. I'd never been afraid of Alex before, but at that moment, with his bloodshot eyes and disheveled face, I hardly recognized him. "Alex, you're drunk. We should talk when you're calm," I suggested, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the trembling coursing through me. "Calm?" he roared, advancing toward me. "How do you expect me to be calm? My mother is dead, Carmen. Dead. And you weren't even here." I collided with the wall, panic seizing me. "I'm sorry, really. But I was hurt, confused. The things you said after the funeral, the things I said?" His face came close, just inches from mine, the reek of alcohol heavy on his breath. "You have no idea, Carmen. You know nothing." That's when I saw it. In his right hand, partly hidden by the sleeve of his crumpled shirt, something metallic caught the light. A chill surged down my spine as I realized it was a kitchen knife. "Alex," I whispered, unable to tear my eyes from the blade. "What are you doing?" For a moment he looked puzzled, as if he didn't understand how the knife had ended up there. Then his expression hardened. "Something I should have done a long time ago. Everything happened in seconds." Alex raised his arm, and on pure instinct I leaped to the side. The knife plunged into the wall where my head had been moments before. Taking advantage of his surprise, I shoved him with all my might and raced for the door. "Carmen!" His furious roar pursued me as I bolted out of the apartment. I dashed down the stairs two at a time, my heart thundering so loudly I feared it might burst from my chest. I could hear Alex's footsteps closing in behind me. I stumbled onto the street, gasping for breath, my eyes frantically searching for help. Few in Carroll Street, normally teeming with life, seemed deserted at that moment. I caught sight of a group of tourists near the entrance of the Tribunal metro station, but they were too distant. I knew I wouldn't make it before Alex caught up. I turned onto Velarde Street, desperate to find anyone. That's when I saw it, the bar The Milky Way, one of our favorites from our early days together. Its lights were on, and I could see movement inside. Without hesitating, I sprinted toward the door. I burst in like a breath of air, startling the few patrons present at that early hour. The bartender, a kindly older man with graying mustache who knew us from our many visits, looked at me with worry. "Carmen? What's wrong, dear?" There was no time for a reply. The door slammed open, and there stood Alex, panting, the knife still in hand, his eyes crazed. Time seemed to stand still. The patrons froze, unable to process what they were witnessing. The bartender, Manny, was the first to react. "Alex, son, what are you doing?" "Put that knife down," he said calmly, though I could see the fear in his eyes. Alex appeared deaf to him. His eyes remained locked on me, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. He stepped forward, and I backed into the counter. "The game's over, Carmen," he snarled. "There's no escape now." Then something inside me shattered. All the fear, confusion, and pain of recent weeks boiled over into a fierce anger that I never knew I had. "Enough, Alex," I shouted, surprised by the strength in my voice. "What do you think you're doing? Do you believe this is what your mother would have wanted?" My words hit him like a blow. He staggered, and for a moment I saw a flash of the man I had once fallen in love with, lost and frightened. I didn't," he stuttered, staring at the knife in his hand as though seeing it for the first time. At that moment, the bar door burst open again and 2 police officers entered, likely alerted by a customer who had managed to call unnoticed. "Police! Everyone, freeze!" What followed was a flurry of movement and shouts. Alex dropped the knife, which clattered on the tiled floor. The officers quickly subdued him, cuffing him as he allowed them to take him down, as if all resistance had abandoned him. I stood there, pressed against the counter, trembling uncontrollably as the adrenaline ebbed away. Manny wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and gently guided me to a chair. "It's over now, dear." "It's all over," he murmured, his voice a steady anchor amid the storm raging inside me. As the officers led Alex away, our eyes met one last time. In his gaze I saw a blend of regret, confusion, and something else, something I couldn't quite decipher at that moment, but that would haunt me in the days to come. When the door closed behind them, I collapsed. The tears I'd been holding back flowed freely as sobs shook my body. Manny embraced me, murmuring comforting words that barely registered. In that moment, surrounded by the familiar scent of beer and old wood in a bar filled with so many happy memories, I realized that my life had changed irrevocably. The man with whom I had shared years of my life, the man I thought I knew better than anyone, had become a dangerous stranger. As murmurs spread among the bar's patrons and I listened to the sirens of more police cars approaching, one question kept echoing in my mind, a question that would haunt me in the days ahead. What really happened to Rosalie? What dark secret was slowly consuming Alex from within? That afternoon, as dusk fell over Madrid, I knew this unexpected attack was only the beginning of something far bigger and more terrifying, something that, unbeknownst to me, would force me to confront my worst fears and uncover truths I'd rather have never known. The hours after the incident at the Milky Way passed in a blur. I found myself sitting in a cold metal chair at the central precinct on Leganito Street, surrounded by the constant hum of police activity. The air reeked of stale coffee and disinfectant, mixed with the sweat of lingering fear. A police officer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a slight Andalusian accent, had offered me a cup of tea that now cooled in my trembling hands. She introduced herself as Inspector Ramirez, and her soft voice contrasted with the hardness of the questions she asked. "Mrs. Vega, I need you to tell me everything that happened, from the very beginning, please." I took a sip of tea, grateful for the warmth that eased my throat, and began my story. I recounted the funeral of Rosalie, my argument with Alex, the weeks I spent at Sophie's. When I reached the part about the attack, my voice broke. He wasn't himself, I murmured, more to myself than to the inspector. The Alex I knew would never have done something like that. Inspector Ramirez nodded sympathetically. Had he shown any signs of violent behavior before? I shook my head. Never. We had our problems, like any couple, but he never raised his hand against me. He never even shouted during our arguments. And did you notice any change in his behavior after his mother's death? The question made me pause. Yes, Alex had changed after Rosalie died, but when had that change begun? I tried to recall the exact moment when my husband transformed into a stranger. He was distant, I finally said. Even before the funeral. When Rosalie died, I expected him to be shattered, but he seemed absent, as if he were in another world. The inspector scribbled in her notebook, her face a mask of professionalism. Did he ever mention anything about the circumstances of his mother's death? I frowned. Not really. Now that I think about it, he avoided discussing it. Whenever I asked, he would change the subject or leave the room. I understand, she said, closing her notebook. Mrs. Vega, I must be honest with you. Your husband's situation is complicated. The charges are serious, attempted assault with a bladed weapon, disturbing the peace, but there's more. My heart skipped a beat. More? What do you mean? Inspector Ramirez met my gaze directly, her eyes filled with a mix of compassion and concern. We've been investigating the death of Rosalie Garcia. Initially, it was ruled natural, but some inconsistencies have come to light. The world around me seemed to stop. Her words echoed in my ears, yet my mind refused to process them. What are you suggesting? We're not suggesting anything yet, Mrs. Vega. But we need to explore every possibility. Did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to your mother-in-law's death? I tried to remember, but everything was a blur, a jumble of hushed arguments and uncomfortable silences. No, I'm not sure. Everything felt tense, but it was always like that when Rosalie was around. The inspector nodded sympathetically. I know it's difficult, but even the smallest detail could be important. I closed my eyes, trying to organize my thoughts. Suddenly, a memory surfaced from deep within. There was, one night, a few days before Rosalie died. Alex came home late, reeking of alcohol. We argued, and he said something about everything changing soon, that we'd no longer have to worry about his mother. Inspector Ramirez leaned in, clearly intrigued. Do you remember exactly what he said? I shook my head, frustrated. Not precisely. He was very agitated, mumbling. But I remember how scared I was by the way he said it, as if he truly believed something was about to happen. She scribbled more notes. Mrs. Vega, I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you think your husband might have had something to do with his mother's death? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Could Alex really have killed his own mother? My mind screamed no, it was impossible. But then I remembered the look in his eyes at the bar, that mix of madness and desperation. And for the first time, a seed of doubt took root in my heart. I don't know, I whispered, tears beginning to well in my eyes. I'm no longer sure what Alex is capable of. Inspector Ramirez placed a reassuring hand over mine. It's all right, Mrs. Vega. I know this is a lot to process. We'll keep investigating, and I promise we'll get to the bottom of this. Just then, the door to the interrogation room burst open. A young officer, his face pale and sweaty, hurried in. Inspector, you need to come. It's urgent. Inspector Ramirez immediately rose. What's happened? The officer glanced nervously in my direction before answering. It's the detainee, Mrs. Vega. Alex Soto. He's saying things. Things that make no sense. My heart lurched. What kind of things? What is he saying? The officer hesitated to speak in front of me, but Inspector Ramirez nodded, giving him permission. He's talking about his mother. He says he can hear her. That she's here in the station. A chill ran down my spine. The inspector looked at me with concern. Mrs. Vega, please stay here. I'll be back shortly. I watched as they hurried out, leaving me alone with my tumultuous thoughts. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall and the frantic beating of my heart. I don't know how long it took, minutes, perhaps hours, until suddenly, a blood-curdling scream shattered the stillness, making me jump to my feet. It was Alex's voice, unmistakable. Leave me alone. Get out. You're dead. His screams echoed through the precinct's corridors, mingling with the sound of hurried footsteps and shouted orders. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against the wood, trying to understand what was happening. No, don't come any closer. Carmen, help me. Hearing my name on his lips chilled me to the bone. What was Alex seeing? What was terrifying him so much? Then, as abruptly as it began, the chaos stopped. The screams ceased, leaving an even more terrifying silence in their wake. I backed away from the door, my mind reeling, trying to process what I had just heard. Several minutes later, the door opened once more. Inspector Ramirez entered, her face a mask of worry and confusion. Mrs. Vega, she began wearily, your husband. He's had an episode. The doctors are with him now. What happened? I asked in a barely audible whisper. What was he screaming about? The inspector hesitated before replying, Mrs. Vega, your husband appears to be suffering from some kind of psychotic break. He's talking about seeing his mother, hearing her. He claims she's here, accusing him. My mind reeled, trying to absorb this new information. But that's impossible. Rosalie is dead. I know, the inspector said softly. That's why we're so concerned about his mental state. We're transferring him to a psychiatric facility for a full evaluation. I sank into a chair, feeling as though the weight of the world was crushing me. Can I see him? She shook her head. I'm sorry, but it's not advisable right now. He's sedated and needs to rest. Besides, given the nature of the charges against him, visits aren't allowed at the moment. I nodded numbly, too stunned to argue. Inspector Ramirez sat down across from me, her face grave. Mrs. Vega, I know this is overwhelming, but I need to ask one more thing. Has your husband ever shown signs of mental illness? Hallucinations, extreme mood swings, erratic behavior. I shook my head, tears beginning to fall. No, never. Alex was always normal, stable, until now. She nodded and continued taking notes. I understand. We'll investigate this thoroughly, Mrs. Vega. Both the death of your mother-in-law and your husband's condition. I promise we'll get to the bottom of it. I sat there in the cold interrogation room as night fell over Madrid. Through a small window, I could see the city's lights flickering on, life carrying on as if nothing had happened. But for me, the world had come to a standstill. What really happened to Rosalie? Was Alex losing his mind, or was something even more sinister at play? And most importantly, how had our lives come to this? Walking out of the station with Inspector Ramirez later, I felt as if I were teetering on the edge of an abyss. The silence that followed Alex's screams was deafening, filled with unanswered questions and unspoken fears. As the Madrid night enveloped me on my walk, I was struck by one certainty. This was only the beginning. The quiet between Alex's screams was the prelude to a storm that threatened to engulf us all. And I, Carmen Vega, stood at its center, struggling to remain upright as the world around me crumbled. The truth, whatever it may be, was out there, waiting to be uncovered. And though the thought terrified me, I knew I had no choice but to press on. For Alex, for Rosalie, and for myself. The silence had ended, and it was time to face whatever came next. In the days following the incident at the bar, a haze of confusion and fear enveloped me. I, Carmen, wandered Madrid's streets like a ghost, unable to fully process what had happened. News about Alex was scarce and contradictory. The police continued their investigation, as baffled as I was by recent events. One morning, while trying to distract myself with a coffee on a terrace at Olivide Square, I received a call from Inspector Ramirez. Mrs. Vega, her voice sounded tense even over the phone, I need you to come to the station. There's been a development in your husband's case. A fresh knot tightened in my stomach. What happened? Is Alex all right? There was a pause before she answered. I'd prefer to discuss it in person, if possible. Can you come now? I mechanically agreed, forgetting for a moment that she couldn't see me. Yes, of course. I'll be there in half an hour. The drive to the station was a blur of streets and unfamiliar faces. My mind raced, imagining every possible scenario, each worse than the last. Had Alex done something? Or had something happened to him? When I arrived, Inspector Ramirez was waiting at the entrance. Her normally calm face was etched with worry and fear. The knot in my stomach tightened further. Thank you for coming so quickly, Mrs. Vega, she said, leading me inside. What we're about to show you is hard to explain. I think it's best if you see it for yourself. She took me to a small observation room, separated from another room by a one-way mirror. Through the glass, I could see Alex sitting in a chair, his hands cuffed to the table before him. He looked pale and haggard, with deep bags under his eyes and a vacant stare. What's happening? I asked, unable to take my eyes off him. Inspector Ramirez took a deep breath before replying. We've been interrogating your husband about his mother's death. At first, he refused to speak, but a few hours ago, well, he started saying things. Things that don't make any sense. I frowned, confused. What kind of things? He says he can hear his mother, that she speaks to him. A chill ran down my spine. But that's impossible. Rosalie is dead. Inspector Ramirez nodded. We know. That's why we're so worried. At first, we thought it might be a psychotic episode, but her voice trailed off, and I could see doubt in her eyes. But what? I pressed. She looked directly into my eyes. Mrs. Vega, what I'm about to show you defies all logic. I can't explain it, but I think you need to see it for yourself. With that, she pressed a button on a control panel, and the sound from the room where Alex was being held filled our observation room. At first, all I could hear was Alex's rapid breathing. Then, suddenly, his head jerked up as if he had heard something. "No," he murmured in a raspy, frightened voice. "No, please. Leave me alone." And then I heard it, a voice, clear as day, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Alex, my son." I froze. It was Rosalie's voice. There was no mistaking it. Alex began to tremble visibly. "You're not real. You can't be real. You're dead." Rosalie's voice sounded again, now tinged with sorrow. "Oh, Alex, what have you done?" I turned to the inspector, searching her face for the same shock I felt, but she only returned a look of concern and confusion. Can he really hear her?" I whispered. Inspector Ramirez nodded slowly. "Everyone can. We've reviewed the recordings over and over. There's no trickery, no tampering. That voice, it's genuinely there." I refocused on Alex, who was now openly sobbing. "I'm sorry," he whimpered. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to." "What didn't you mean, Alex?" Rosalie's voice was now harsh, accusatory. "Did you not want her to die? Or did you not want them to find out what you did?" It felt as though the ground were crumbling beneath me. Was Rosalie hinting at what I feared? Had Alex really? "It was an accident," Alex whispered, his voice breaking with tears. "I only wanted you to shut up, to stop controlling my life. I never meant to." "What never meant to, son? Not meant to push me down the stairs? Not meant to watch my head hit the ground?" I let out a strangled cry, my legs giving out beneath me. Inspector Ramirez caught me and helped me sit on a nearby chair. "It can't be," I murmured, more to myself than anyone else. "This can't be happening." But it was. Before my eyes, my husband was confessing to murdering his own mother too. What? A ghost? A collective hallucination? Nothing made sense. Rosalie's voice continued relentlessly. "And what about Carmen, Alex? Were you going to do the same to her? Is that why you attacked her?" Alex jerked his head up, his eyes filled with terror. "No, I'd never hurt you, Carmen. I love you. I was just scared, confused. I thought you knew, that you'd betray me." Tears streamed down my cheeks. The man I had loved, the man with whom I had planned to spend the rest of my life, was a murderer. And I had been blind all this time. Inspector Ramirez switched off the audio, plunging the room into a heavy silence. She looked at me with a mix of compassion and concern. "Mrs. Vega, I know this is hard to process. But I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. What we just witnessed is unprecedented. We don't know how to explain it, but it's evidence. Evidence of a crime." I nodded numbly, words failing me as my world crumbled in minutes. "What happens now?" I finally managed to ask. The inspector sighed. "Honestly, I don't know. This goes beyond anything we've ever dealt with. We'll need experts, perhaps even people familiar with paranormal phenomena." At any other time, I might have laughed at the idea. But after everything I had seen, I wasn't sure of anything anymore. "Can I talk to him?" I asked, surprising even myself with the request. The inspector hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. No more. And we'll be watching the whole time. I rose on trembling legs and walked toward the door leading to the interrogation room. Before entering, I took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of strength I had left. When I opened the door, Alex looked up. His eyes, once filled with madness and fear, now appeared empty, defeated. "Carmen," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." I sat opposite him, keeping the distance imposed by the cuffs and the table. For a long, silent moment, we simply stared at each other, two strangers who had once loved. "Why, Alex?" I finally asked, my voice breaking. "Why did you do it?" He lowered his gaze, unable to meet my eyes. "I don't know. I was so angry, so tired of her control. It was a moment of madness. I never meant to, but you did," I interrupted, anger replacing the shock. "You killed your own mother. And then you tried, what? To kill me too." Alex shook his head violently. "No, I'd never hurt you, Carmen. I love you." I was scared, confused. "I thought you knew, thought you'd expose me, and that was reason enough to attack me with a knife." The incredulity in my voice was palpable. He offered no reply, simply lowered his head, silent tears falling onto the table. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, though it was probably only seconds. Finally, I gathered the courage to ask the question that had been gnawing at me. "Alex, can you really hear your mother?" His head snapped up, and for a moment I saw the same terror I had witnessed before in his eyes. "She's here," he whispered, looking around frantically. "Always here. She won't leave me alone, Carmen." Day and night, her voice, her accusations, a chill ran down my spine. Part of me wanted to believe this was all an elaborate lie, a tactic to avoid the consequences of his actions. But I had seen and heard things that defied explanation. "I'm sorry, Alex," I finally said, standing up. "But I can't help you. Not after what you've done." As I turned to leave, his desperate voice stopped me. "Carmen," he called, his tone pleading. "Please, don't leave me alone with her. I can't bear it anymore." I looked back one last time. The man I had once loved, the man with whom I had planned a future, was now a stranger, a murderer haunted by the ghost of his victim. "Goodbye, Alex," I whispered and walked out of the room. Outside, Inspector Ramirez was waiting. Without a word, she led me back to the observation room. "What now?" I asked, feeling utterly drained. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Honestly, I don't know. This goes beyond anything we've ever seen. We'll have to consult experts, perhaps even paranormal specialists." At any other moment, I might have laughed at the idea. But after what I'd witnessed, I wasn't sure of anything anymore. "And me?" I asked, suddenly feeling lost. "What am I supposed to do now?" The inspector regarded me with compassion. "For now, go home, Mrs. Vega. Rest. We'll have more questions in the coming days, but for now, try to process all of this. And please, do not speak of it to anyone. The last thing we need is for this to leak to the press." I nodded mechanically and made my way to the exit. As I walked through Madrid's streets, the late afternoon sun bathed the city in a warm, golden glow. Life went on around me, oblivious to the fact that my world had just collapsed. Rosalie's voice, clear and accusatory, still echoed in my ears. Was it truly the ghost of my mother-in-law, seeking justice from beyond the grave? Or was it something more sinister, something we couldn't understand? As the bustle of the city enveloped me, one thing was clear: the voice from the shadows, whatever it was, had changed our lives forever. And this was only the beginning of a mystery that threatened to consume us all. The days following the revelation at the station passed in a daze. Carmen, moved through the streets of Madrid like a specter, unable to fully grasp what had occurred. Alex's confession, Rosalie's voice, it all felt like a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. One morning, while trying to distract myself with a coffee on a terrace at Chueca Square, I received a call from Inspector Ramirez. "Mrs. Vega," her voice was tense even over the phone, "I need you to come to the station. There are new developments in the case." I felt my stomach twist. What more could have happened? "Is it about Alex? Is he okay?" There was a pause before she answered. "I'd rather discuss it in person. Can you come now?" Half an hour later, I found myself once again in the chilly interrogation room at the station. Inspector Ramirez sat across from me, her normally serene face now a mask of professional concern. "Mrs. Vega," she began, "we've been thoroughly investigating your mother-in-law, Rosalie Garcia's case. And we've discovered some irregularities." I frowned. "What kind of irregularities?" She opened a folder and spread its contents before her. According to her medical records, Rosalie suffered from a heart condition. However, the autopsy revealed no signs of a heart attack or any other natural cause of death. My heart began to race. "What are you saying?" "We're saying that Rosalie Garcia's death wasn't natural. She was murdered." The words hit me like a bucket of icy water. Despite Alex's confession, a part of me had clung to the hope that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. But Alex said it was an accident," I murmured, more to myself than to the inspector. "Yes, that's what he claimed," she replied. "But the evidence suggests otherwise. The wounds on Rosalie's body aren't consistent with a fall down the stairs. They were deliberate." Nausea overwhelmed me. Who was the man I had married? How had I been so blind? The inspector continued in a soft but firm voice. Mrs. Vega, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Did you notice anything unusual in your husband's behavior in the days leading up to Rosalie's death? I closed my eyes, trying to recall. The days before her death were a jumble of tension and hushed arguments. But there was something. There was one night I began slowly, a few days before Rosalie died. Alex came home late, reeking of alcohol. We argued, and he said something about everything changing soon, that we wouldn't have to worry about his mother anymore. Inspector Ramirez leaned forward, clearly intrigued. Do you remember exactly what he said? I shook my head, frustrated. Not exactly. He was very agitated, mumbling. But I remember being terrified by the way he said it, as if he truly believed something was about to happen. She wrote quickly. Did Alex ever mention any financial troubles? Or perhaps an inheritance? I frowned, confused. Not that I recall. Alex was always very private about the family finances. Why do you ask? She hesitated before answering. We've discovered that Rosalie Garcia had a considerable fortune. According to her will, much of it was to be donated to various charities. Alex wasn't set to inherit a thing. It felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath me. Are you suggesting that Alex killed his mother for money? It's one possibility we're considering, she replied cautiously. But there's more. We've found evidence that Alex had been forging his mother's signature on several financial documents, diverting funds from Rosalie's accounts into an overseas account. My head spun. How is it possible I knew nothing of this? How had Alex managed to keep so many secrets? I don't understand, I murmured, tears welling in my eyes. Why wouldn't he tell me? Why? My voice trailed off as a dreadful thought struck me. The inspector seemed to read my expression. Mrs. Vega, she said softly, have you ever suspected your husband might be involved in illegal activities? I shook my head vehemently. No, never. I trusted him. I thought I knew him. She nodded empathetically. I understand this is hard to digest, but I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you ever notice anything suspicious? Strange phone calls, secret meetings, large sums of money appearing out of nowhere. I racked my memory, searching for anything I might have overlooked. And then, like a flash, a memory surfaced. There was, once, I began slowly. A few months ago, I found an envelope stuffed with cash hidden in Alex's closet. When I asked him about it, he said it was a work bonus he'd been paid in cash to avoid taxes. It struck me as odd, but I trusted him. Inspector Ramirez scribbled more notes. Do you remember roughly how much was in that envelope? I closed my eyes, trying to picture it. I'm not sure. Maybe around 20,000 euros. Her face grew grave. Mrs. Vega, I'm afraid your husband has been involved in far more serious matters than we had imagined. Not only the murder of his mother, but also large-scale financial fraud. It felt as though my world was collapsing around me. The man I thought I knew, the man I had shared my life with, was a complete stranger. A murderer. A con man. What happens now? I managed to whisper. Inspector Ramirez closed her folder and looked at me with a mixture of compassion and determination. We're going to continue our investigation. We'll need your full cooperation, Mrs. Vega. Every piece of information, no matter how insignificant it might seem, could be crucial. I nodded numbly, feeling utterly overwhelmed. Of course. I'll do whatever it takes. As I rose to leave, the inspector stopped me with one final, delicate question. Mrs. Vega, there's one more thing I need to ask you. It's delicate. Have you heard that voice again? The voice of Rosalie. A chill ran down my spine. No, I answered honestly. I haven't heard it again. She nodded slowly. I understand. If you do hear it again, or if you experience anything unusual, please let us know immediately. I left the station feeling as if I'd aged 10 years in 1 hour. The afternoon sun bathed Madrid's streets, but to me, the world had turned gray and cold. Wandering aimlessly along the streets I once strolled with Alex, I realized my life would never be the same. The secrets now exposed were like a poison seeping into every aspect of my existence. I stopped in front of a fountain at Orient Square, watching the water cascade down, seemingly indifferent to the turmoil inside me. How many more secrets had Alex been hiding? How many lies had I believed? Then, as a whisper on the wind, I heard that voice again, Rosalie's voice. Carmen. I spun around, searching for its source, but no one was there. The square was nearly empty, save for a few tourists snapping photos of the royal palace in the distance. Carmen, be careful. This time, the voice sounded closer, more urgent. Panic gripped me. Was I losing my mind? Or was Rosalie truly trying to reach out to me? He isn't what he seems, the voice continued. There are more secrets, Carmen. Many more. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the voice faded away, leaving me trembling and confused in the middle of the square. As the sun set over Madrid, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, I realized this was only the beginning. The dam of secrets had burst, and what was spilling out was darker and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The truth, whatever it may be, was out there. And I, Carmen Vega, was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Because I had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The following weeks were a whirlwind of interrogations, investigations, and increasingly disturbing revelations. I, Carmen, felt as though I were trapped in an endless nightmare where every day brought a new, horrifying surprise. Rosalie's voice had become a constant presence in my life. Sometimes it was just a faint whisper on the wind, other times as clear as if she were standing right beside me. Her warnings were cryptic, yet always urgent. Be careful, Carmen. Trust no one. The truth is closer than you think. One particularly overwhelming afternoon, while I was walking through Retiro Park trying to clear my mind, I received a call from Inspector Ramirez. Mrs. Vega, her voice was tense, almost frightened. I need you to come to the station immediately. Something has happened, something I can't explain over the phone. Fear seized me. Is it about Alex? Is he all right? There was a pause before she replied, It's complicated. Please, come as soon as you can. Half an hour later, I found myself again in the cold interrogation room. Inspector Ramirez stood by the window, her face pale and tense. Mrs. Vega, she began in a barely audible whisper, what I'm about to show you defies all logic. Honestly, I don't know how to explain it. She walked over to a monitor in the corner and pressed play. The screen displayed Alex's cell. He sat on his bed, staring blankly at the wall in front of him. Suddenly, the image began to distort. Lines of static crossed the screen, and for a moment, I thought it was a technical glitch. But then I saw it. A hazy figure began to form in the cell. It was blurry at first, but gradually took shape. It was a woman, tall and slender, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. Rosalie. My heart froze. This can't be real, I murmured. Inspector Ramirez said nothing, simply watching the screen with a mix of fascination and horror. In the video, Alex finally noticed the presence in a cell. His face contorted into pure terror. No, he shouted, retreating to a corner of the cell. You're not real. You're dead. The figure of Rosalie moved closer, her voice clear and firm despite the static interference. Oh, Alex, she said, her tone a blend of sorrow and disappointment. What have you done? Do you think you can escape your crimes so easily? Alex began to weep, covering his face with his hands. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't want. I didn't think. What didn't you think? Rosalie interrupted. Did you never consider that you'd be caught? That you'd ruin so many lives with your actions? Inspector Ramirez paused the video and turned toward me. Her face was ashen, her eyes a mix of fear and confusion. Mrs. Vega, she said softly, I know this is hard to believe. Honestly, I'm struggling to understand it myself. But I need to ask, have you experienced anything similar? Have you seen or heard Rosalie outside of the station? A shiver ran down my spine. Should I tell her about the voices I'd been hearing? Would she believe me? Or would she think I was losing my mind? Finally, I decided that, however incredible it seemed, the truth was the only option. Yes, I whispered. I've heard her. I haven't seen her, but her voice, it's always with me. Inspector Ramirez nodded slowly, as if my confession confirmed something she'd long suspected. "What does she say?" she asked. "Warnings, mostly," I replied. "She tells me to be careful, not to trust anyone. That there are more secrets waiting to be uncovered." The inspector ran a hand through her hair, clearly overwhelmed. "Mrs. Vega, what we're facing goes beyond anything I've seen in my career. I don't know if it's a paranormal phenomenon or some kind of psychic interference, but I do know we need to get to the bottom of it." I nodded, feeling a resolve I hadn't felt in weeks. "What do you need me to do?" "We need to speak with Alex," she said. "And I believe you're the only one who can make him talk." My heart pounded. The thought of facing Alex, of looking him in the eyes, the man who had shattered my life, terrified me. But I knew it was necessary. "I will," I declared, surprising even myself with the firmness in my voice. Minutes later, I found myself standing before Alex's cell. He sat on his bed, his gaze vacant. When he saw me, his eyes lit up for a moment before quickly filling with shame and fear. "Carmen," he whispered, "what are you doing here?" "I need answers, Alex," I said, forcing steadiness into my voice. "I need to know the truth. All of it." He closed his eyes, as if the weight of his secrets were too much to bear. "You wouldn't understand," he mumbled. "Try me," I insisted. "Why did you do it? Why did you kill your mother?" Alex lifted his eyes, and for a fleeting moment I saw a glimmer of the man I had once loved. "It wasn't just about the money," he finally confessed. It was because of you." The words hit me like a punch. "What?" "My mother. She knew things about me. Things I'd done before I met you. Horrible things. She threatened to tell you everything, to destroy our life together. I couldn't let that happen." Tears streamed down my face. "What things, Alex? What could be so terrible?" He opened his mouth to speak, but then the temperature in the cell plummeted. A shiver ran down my spine, and I knew without looking that Rosalie was there. "Tell the truth, Alex." Her voice resonated in the cell. "Tell her who you really are." Alex began to shake uncontrollably. I'm not who you think I am, Carmen. My real name isn't Alex Soto. I'm a fugitive. I've been on the run for years." My world crumbled once again. "What are you running from?" "From my crimes," he whispered. "I've done things, unforgivable things. Robberies, fraud, and worse." Rosalie's voice cut in, cold and accusatory. "Tell them about the other women, Alex. Tell them about the lives you've destroyed." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Other women?" He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "You're not the first, Carmen. There have been others. Women I deceived, robbed, and some didn't survive to tell the tale." My legs buckled beneath me. I leaned against the wall, trying to process the enormity of his confession. Are you a serial killer?" I managed to whisper. Alex said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Rosalie's voice filled the cell once more. "It's time for you to pay for your crimes, Alex. It's time all your victims find peace." Suddenly, the cell was flooded with a blinding light. I closed my eyes instinctively, and when I opened them again, the scene before me took my breath away. Translucent figures filled the cell, women of all ages, their faces etched with pain and accusation. And at the center, Alex, kneeling and sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," he wailed repeatedly. "I'm so sorry." But the figures showed no mercy. They moved toward him, their ghostly hands reaching out to his trembling form. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The light faded, the figures vanished, and Alex collapsed, motionless on the floor. Guards rushed into the cell, followed closely by Inspector Ramirez. They attempted to revive him, but it was too late. He had taken his final breath. I stood there in shock, unable to process what I had just witnessed. Inspector Ramirez approached, her face a mask of confusion and concern. "Mrs. Vega," she said softly, "what happened here?" I looked at her, then at Alex, and finally at the empty space where the figures had been. "Justice," I whispered. "I think justice has finally been served." As forensic teams arrived and activity in the cell surged, I realized this marked not only the end of one chapter in my life, but the beginning of another. Alex's revelations, the supernatural intervention, everything had changed my world forever. That night, I left the station and walked the streets of Madrid under a starry sky. The weight of shattered secrets and hard-won truths accompanied me, yet I also felt an unexpected sense of freedom. Rosalie's voice echoed one last time, gentle as a summer breeze. "You are safe now, Carmen. Live your life. Be happy." And as the city lights shone all around me, I knew that despite all the pain and betrayal, I had survived. Alex's final breath had marked the end of a nightmare and the beginning of my new life. Madrid, with its storied streets and nights full of promise, stretched out before me. And I, Carmen Vega, was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that no matter how painful the truth, it would always find its way into the light.